Let's bring in now from Amnesty International, Joel McKay. Good to talk to you, Joel. Look, the situation in India is dire. Because it's a developing country, it has a massive population, it's likely to get worse. But what is the justification? What is the rationale for a travel ban on Australian citizens in India now when so many other countries have had higher rates of infection?
Well, there is no justification. What this is a blatant breach of human rights. The Australian government has obligations under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant for Political and Civil Rights, and they're completely throwing that out the window for a decision that just doesn't make sense.
Normally, if you have an Australian passport, if you have Australian citizenship, the one thing that guarantees you is entry to your country. It can't guarantee you anything else except some help from your country while you're overseas, but it's your golden ticket to get home. It is a breach of international law, isn't it, to deny that right, unless there's some overwhelming necessity.
Yes, like I said, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant on Civil Political Rights, both of them that Australia is signatory to, says that we must allow Australians to return to the country.
It's pretty open and clear cut. I should point out some other countries are banning flights from India, but these are not countries that have hotel quarantine and mandatory quarantine, so it's a slightly different situation. What astounds me is that we've had human rights in this country impinged all year, and often unnecessarily. We've had state borders closed when there's virtually no cases. We've had whole cities of 2 million people locked down on the basis of single cases. So people have been denied their opportunity for education, for family and social connections, to run their businesses. Where have the human rights activists been all year when it's come to these sorts of infringements?
Chris, we've been talking about these types of infringements all year as well. We just released a report a couple of weeks ago talking about the overreach of police throughout this time, particularly in New South Wales. You're right, this is a time where human rights must be balanced with emergency powers and crisis powers. And to fix that, what we actually need is a Federal Human Rights Act in Australia, which will help us hold the government to account.
Well, we have an Australian Human Rights Commission, and they've been silent on these domestic issues, or next to silent. They're speaking up now about this issue of Australians returning from India. I agree with them on that, but they've been silent when people have been arrested in their own homes for posting on social media opposition to government policies.
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Well, I invite you to criticise them then.
That they have a role to play, and it is great that they have come out in recent days around the situation with returning Aussies. And like I said, Amnesty International has been solid on this for the last 15, 16 months. We've got to balance human rights with additional emergency powers. Look,
we have the Australian Human Rights Commission, we have state human rights bodies as well, and over the past year we've had pregnant mums not being able to go to the closest hospital, going 1,000 kilometres south to Sydney because of Queensland's blocked borders, and a life being lost possibly as a consequence. We've had people stranded on the wrong side of borders from their families. We've had people's businesses disrupted by this. We should have been hearing daily, surely, from the Australian Human Rights Council, recognising the need of health measures and the balancing act, but they should have been a voice for moderation and common sense here.
Sure, we obviously love to see the Human Rights Commission constantly talking about these types of things. But when there's so many human rights violations occurring from Australian governments right across the country, particularly in terms of overreach with COVID, it's not the Commission's fault, it's the Australian government's fault. They have the obligations to human rights law and standards, and they're the ones that should be upholding their own standards.
The issue here is risk, isn't it? It's managing risk and having a proportionate response. Overall, has Australia's response been disproportionate?
Well, the problem is that the Australian government 15, 16 months ago should have been set up for this risk. The quarantine system in Australia just isn't ready for a situation like India. The hotel quarantine programs run by the states need to be turbocharged. We need a bigger quarantine facility such as Howard Springs up in Darwin. That needs to be expanded. We need to be building extra quarantine facilities.
I hear that all the time, but as I said at the top of the program, hotel quarantine has worked fine in New South Wales, and that's processed 2/3 of the returnees. So I think it's a bit of a sidebar, but I appreciate you coming in, Joel. Great. See you next time.
Thanks, Chris.
That's Joel McKay from Amnesty International. You know, so often I disagree with what they've got to say, but they're right on this. If you are an Australian citizen, you have every right to come home to your country, and there's no justification for denying that to people in India when we never denied it to people in the UK, the US, France, Germany, wherever else last year, when their situation was as bad or worse than India's now.